Hello, everyone. So this is our last lesson, um, which means I am going to start by talking about how the end of the semester is going to go. Of course, this means I'm going to talk about final exam and how we're going to go about doing that. So that will be the first thing we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about dates, what you're supposed to hand in, how you're supposed to do it. And then I'll move on to more of the content, the final content in the class, which will be about secondary stress and intonation. So there are going to be three parts. First part is going to be sort of organizational. We'll get that out of the way so that you're clear about, what you are supposed to do in the next 2 weeks. And then we're going to move on to the content in the next two parts. So as far as what we're doing in this class, if you have probably already looked at the calendar for the UFR, and you will have noticed that next week, the weekend, Easter week, we are not having class. Right, you are lucky because you will have that opportunity to prepare for our final exam, which will be due the following week, which is the 21st of April. That is Tuesday the 21st. When your exam will be due, meaning, of course, this is an exam that you are going to do individually on your computers at home, and you are going to send that to me by the 21st, right? I will send that to you on noon using the same address that we have, and we've by now all of your email addresses are kind of fixed. So I will send that exam, right? Let's just say the questions on the preceding day, Monday, right? The 20th. So on the 20th of April, I send you the exam. You send it back to me the next day. Okay, so what is this exam going to be? Well, there are going to be three parts. There is going to be a listening comprehension part, and there is going to be a speaking part where you are going to record yourself speaking, and there is going to be a written part, which is much like we would have done our exam if we had done it at Paris 8. So the first part, the listening comprehension, that will involve, I will send you a document that will be an MP3, a short document, and there will be a series of questions about the content. It's fairly straightforward. You are just supposed to give as much relevant detail as possible. It is not interpretive. It is very factual. As I said, I've mentioned this a few times. We don't practice this because I honestly think that you are much better off doing stuff that interests you. We don't sit there and listen to something and I ask you factual questions about it. Those of you who go off on your own and listen to the music you like and watch the movies you like and so on, watch the documentaries you like in English, though that is the best way to prepare, and it's, so this I've repeated, so we haven't practices per se, but I've reminded you to do these things, to get out there and cultivate the things that you are into, because you are serious English specialist, right? So that will be the first part. That will be that listening comprehension. I hope, and those of you who have been, following things that are going on in the English world, you will probably find that, to be honest, fairly easy. Now the next part is going to be the speaking part, and that will involve. There are going to be two parts, and there's going to be one part where all you're going to have to do is read a set of words and then a sentence, right? And then there's going to be a third part, which is going to be more open, where you are going to, I will give you a few topics. For example, I could ask you to talk about the current political situation in France or something like that. Or I'll give you a free topic. And you're only going to talk about, you could talk about yourself, you could talk about, whatever it may be. And that will be just 1 minute, right? So, and also I would advise you not to be bent out of shape about doing this sort of more open part, right? It's easier. it's really difficult actually to read words, right? It's not as natural. You're sort of hindered by the sort of written word. What's good is that you'll be able to practice, that you'll have enough time to practice these words and sort of say them. But as far as talking in a freer way, it's easier. There is going to be a factor that's going to play as far as that's concerned. That will the intonation, which is something that we've briefly seen this semester. That will come into play for that. That will help you. And we're actually going to look at intonation today as the content section of this video. So that is the speaking. So we've seen the listening, we've just seen the speaking, and now we're going to move on to the written part. Now the written part is fairly straightforward, especially because we've already done a series of quizzes. We haven't done as many quizzes as we would have been able to do, but you're all familiar, I think, with the kinds of questions you will have. Just a reminder, and what I'm going to say you will find written in the email that you have received. There is going to be obviously a part on word stress, right? So you will have to indicate a stress pattern of a word. Of course, this will mean that you should use your knowledge of stress imposing endings, right? The three kinds of stress imposing endings, the ones that assign stress on the final, the penultimate, and the anti-penultimate syllable, meaning, we have the O1 stress pattern, final, penultimate, we have the 1O stress pattern, and anti-penultimate, the 100 stress pattern. So, of course, as you expect, that will be on it. Then there will also be the question of neutral endings, right? So you're going to start, when you analyze a word, you're going to start looking at the end of the word, and you are going to sort of identify the neutral ending and discard them, right? So that you can, proceed to the analysis proper of the word. Next thing you will take into account will be the new stuff that we saw in phonetics 2, which will involve the adjectival endings such as AR, AL, OUS, right, that we've seen in conjunction with pre-final consonant clusters, right? Words like sort of this would be something like ancestral, right? If you have the AL adjectival ending combined with the STR, which is what we call a pre-final consonant cluster, meaning we have STR, that is more than one consonant, and it occurs immediately before the final syllable, at the syllable boundary, more specifically between the final and the penultimate syllable. So we've seen that. I've just reminded you of what that is. We had a separate class on this. Next is another similar phenomenon insofar as that we have to really look at the morphology of the word. We'll have the ative endings, right? So this is once again adjectival, and it has to do with looking at the ending. The ending would be "iv," and then how it combines with words that derive from words in ate. There's a separate video on that. You can consult that to see about this somewhat subtle aspect. Then we're going to look at something. You'll be tested on something new that I will explain later in this video, which is the question of secondary stress, which you have already seen, right? But we're going to look about secondary stress when we have primary stress that occurs on the fourth or fifth syllable, right, which is something we haven't seen yet. We'll get into the details in a moment. There will be also questions about intonation, which we are going to look at in a moment too. We've already had sort of an introduction to intonation. As a reminder, make sure that you know what we refer to and there's as the basic values. You have the handout on that as a reminder. It's really important, as you know, to start by determining the word stress of a word, right? Then once for the stressed syllables, those receiving primary and secondary stress, to really know your basic values, meaning the short, the long, and the R-colored value, because that is the way that those stressed syllables will be pronounced, right? And then also reciprocally to know for the non-stressed syllables what the reduced value of those syllables will be, right? And so just keep that handy. Go back to learning that we've been going through that the whole way through. And there will also, lastly, keeping in mind this question of basic values, you will be asked to transcribe a passage, right? So that's it. That will be your written part, okay? And I wish you luck with that. I think if you have been following, you should be fairly prepared, and you'll of course you'll have a day to work on it, which is more time than you usually have. So, but it doesn't mean I would still encourage you not just to put everything off to the last minute. It will be much easier for you if you start studying for it now, and that way you won't really miss anything. Everything will be sort of, you'll at least know where to look. You'll be able to handle the various, because there's a lot of different kind of phenomena that you'll be able to handle them if you start studying now. Okay, so now let's move on to our sort of lesson segment. As I said, that we're going to look at two things. Right. The first thing we're going to look at is going to be secondary stress, and then we're going to look at intonation. So secondary stress. Now we've already seen secondary stress, right? When I say we've already seen secondary stress, this is something that we have encountered in Phonetics 1, and we've reviewed this, right? An example of this would be, I can think of, let's say I have to give a few a word. I can say, for example, if I have a word like bunny, right? It's best to give examples. We have bunny, right? Here we notice that we have a two-syllable word, right? Okay, with and there is no prefix, right? And by the way, it's a two-syllable noun. So we say, oh, here we have a two-syllable word without a prefix, and it's a noun. So we're going to have our standard sort of 1-0 stress pattern, right? Okay. So what we notice here is that we have primary stress on the first syllable, right? If you remember, in a normal word, meaning a word that is not a compound, right? Once we have primary stress, right, the following syllables will not be stressed, right? Barring compounds. So that takes care of the following syllables. On the other hand, there may be, right, secondary stress on syllables before the primary stress. So here there is really obviously never going to be any secondary stress because the primary stress occurs on the first syllable, right? So there are no syllables before the primary stress, so there will be no secondary stress. So that means unless we have something like a compound, right? And let's just say what we can call in a normal word, right? Okay, there is going to be there will never be any secondary stress before primary stress, right? Let's look at another word. I'm reviewing here, right? Okay. Now here we have a three-syllable word. En français it's abolir, right? In English we're going to say abolish, right? Now hopefully you can really hear the difference of value between the stressed and the non-stressed syllables. Abolish. So here you can hopefully identify that pattern, and you can also hopefully identify it because you will have noticed this ISH verbal, right? This verbal ISH stress-imposing ending that assigns stress on the syllable before the prefix, right? The penultimate syllable, which is why we have that 1-0 pattern at the end. Okay. Now this time, primary stress occurs on the second syllable, right? So that means, let's say we are determining the stress pattern using our stress-imposing ending. So we have the ish ending, which assigns stress on the penultimate syllable, right? And then which assigns the primary stress at that place, and of course the following syllable will not be stressed. Then we ask ourselves if we have secondary stress. So we notice we always start with primary stress before asking ourselves questions about secondary stress. Here we look to find that it is the second syllable that receives primary stress, so there is only one syllable before primary stress, right? And in this case, right, if it's a normal word, meaning we don't have a separable prefix, for example, right? If we don't have a special case with a separable prefix, this syllable will not be stressed. And if you remember, this is something we saw in the very beginning of the class, because that's why we looked at poetry, because we looked at poetry to sort of look at the way the rhythm of English works, and we notice that there is this thing that we call the alternating stress pattern, right? There's sort of an oscillation between stressed and not stressed, right? And this is why people like Chaucer wrote poems in riding rhythm, right? Okay, we can say, we were the first that ever burst, right? So a ba, right? So that is why, right? If we have primary stress on the second syllable, the first syllable will never be stressed because it is in accordance with the alternating stress pattern in English, right? And of course, we've seen other cases. I'll do this more quickly. We can have another case where let's say the primary stress will occur on the third syllable. So here we have another word, catastrophic. Notice we have the ic stress imposing ending, which assigns stress on the penultimate syllable or the syllable before the ending. So that means we have offic, right? Okay. Now, so we have rof, right? That penultimate syllable is stressed. This time it is the third syllable. So the third syllable receives primary stress. Okay. Now, seeing as our third syllable receives primary stress, that means we have two syllables in front of it. What we've just said about the alternating stress pattern still holds, meaning immediately before that stress syllable, the syllable before that stress syllable, will not be stressed, right? In accordance with the alternating stress pattern. And then we have the pendulum comes full swing, and then meaning the one before it, right? To keep this sort of back and forth stress pattern going along, this syllable will be stressed. And as we have said before, there is only one primary stress in a given stressed word, right? So here we have a stressed word. There's only one primary stress, right? Strophic, right? Which means that this stressed syllable will receive secondary stress, right? Because we're talking about lexical words, right? We've said that there's a correlation between, words have one meaning, right? And the fact that words have one meaning corresponds with the fact that only one of the syllables receives primary stress, right? That is once again, that sort of semantic relationship between word stress and we could talk about words referring to things, if you will. Okay. So that's sort of a review of what we know, right? That we're familiar with. So what we can see is when we're talking about secondary stress, right? And it's usually a question of sort of being aware of how many syllables occur before the one that receives primary stress. So we've seen the case where the primary stress is on the first, the second, or the third, right? So of course, and this is why I like the fact that you're very awake about this. There's always when I'm teaching this the first time someone says, well, wait, what happens if the fourth or the fifth syllable receives primary stress? And I says, we're going to talk about that in phonetics too, right? So this is the time we're talking about this because of course if for example the primary stress occurs on the fourth or the fifth syllable, this pattern, this 201 pattern that we've just discussed, is no longer valid because we have three syllables before the primary stress. So it won't work, right? So the question is, well, what do we do? Well, what happens is what often happens with phonetics too. We have to look at the word and we have to look at the way the word is constructed very often. And this is going to be a question about derivation. Because if we have a long word, right, okay, it means that this word is going to get longer and longer because we're adding suffixes, right, in the construction of this word. We're talking about sort of the etymological construction of the word, right? We start with a root and we keep adding suffixes, right? So that's what we're going to have to look at when we do this. And now I'll refer you to the brochure. What I'm referring to page 40 in the brochure. This is where this is discussed. You will notice this is towards the bottom of the brochure, 6, appendix 2, placing secondary stress, right? Okay. You'll read a review of what I've just said. That's sort of a review of what you know already. And now we get to sort of, the heart of the matter. Notice we have the example of two long words, right? Okay. We have recommendation, and then we have a second word, accommodation. So let's go through this a little bit slowly. Well, first of all, we have two words that end in ion, right? Which is sort of, it's a little bit silly to say ion is an ion type ending, but it is. Which means that ion assigns stress on the penultimate syllable, right? So here we have this Asian recommendation, accommodation, right? Now in both of these words, these are long words, these are 5-syllable words. We have 3 syllables before the primary stress. Recommend. And here we have a So we have 3 before. Okay. So we are going to sort of proceed by sort of asking ourselves, where do these words come from? So if we look at recommendation, we ask ourselves, what does the word recommendation derive itself from? And it will derive itself from recommend, right? Okay. Now recommend, notice we have 2 prefixes, so we're going to have the 201 stress pattern, right? So we ask ourselves, recommendation derives from recommend, right? Okay. So we notice that means that in recommend we have the 201 stress pattern, right? So in the immediately deriving word, the syllable that receives secondary or primary stress, right, will receive the secondary stress. So recommend, right, 201, recommend, right? That means it's going to be rec, not come, that will be stressed. Because obviously, right, when we have our primary stress, the preceding syllable will not be stressed because this is the same exact thing as we have seen for all the preceding examples. Because of that alternating stress pattern, that preceding syllable will not be stressed, right? So it sort of comes down between the first 2 syllables, right? Here it's decided by, the immediately deriving word recommendation derives from recommend. We just consider recommend in isolation. And as we've seen, we have the 201 stress pattern, right? Recommend, right? So that syllable rec that receives secondary stress will also receive secondary stress. The idea is it is stressed, so it will also be stressed, right? Here, in accommodation, right? We look at the word and think about it, and this is actually really, really good for you because let's say if you're studying a literary text, there is actually a literary device that is called derivation, right? And a lot of poets kind of chime, or a lot of writers are going to chime on a word, and they're going to sort of change the suffix, and it's very useful to you. And it is poetically, you are going to be able to say, you're going to not just to say, here we have an example of repetition or anaphora. You're going to say, no, here we have an example of derivation, right? And notice that means sort of that the writer is kind of twisting the word around, right? Okay, and that's something to keep in mind because that is the same thing that's going to be able to help you to understand what's going on here, right? So in this case, we have, accommodation, right? Okay. And you have to look at the word and think, there is an immediately deriving word, right? Okay. And of course you can see it because you're aware of this ate suffix here. You can say, oh yes, accommodation derives from, accommodation derives from accommodate. So you ask yourself, accommodate, where does the stress occur? Now in this time, remember that we have the ate suffix in accommodate, right? And you have learned it. You know that ate assigns stress on the antepenultimate syllable, right? So that means this will be the final, penultimate, anti. So it would be accommodate would receive primary stress, right? So it should just say it's stressed, right? Because of that, it will be stressed, and in this case, it will receive the secondary stress, right? So in a sense, there are 2 cases. Notice with recommend, right? Rec receive secondary stress in the immediately deriving word, it will receive secondary stress, right? Here, in accommodation derives from accommodate, right? And right, receive primary stress in the immediately deriving verb, but it will receive secondary stress because it is subsumed into the new word, right? Okay, so there's a sort of this idea that there's sort of a demotion because what always holds are, I should say, the sort of core rules for the stress patterns, meaning we have primary stress determines the place of secondary stress, right? And that in the immediately deriving word, the syllable that receives primary stress, right, will receive secondary stress, right? Okay. If it already was a syllable that receives secondary stress, it will continue to remain secondary stress, right? So we could say that that distinction between primary stress and secondary stress in the immediately deriving word is sort of blurred, right? Or is sort of gummed out. So that is what you need to know as far as secondary stress is concerned. A lot of that was a little bit of a review. You probably already knew that stuff, but it's a lot easier to understand it if you kind of look at that in the continuity of what you've seen before. And if you would like to practice that, there are exercises on this question on page 17, right? But what we have referred to is the sort of guidelines that I gave you, and I went into more detail. You can see on page 40. So I'm going to shut off this video now. We're going to have one last video on the on intonation, and then that will be it. Thanks very much.